Is the recording right? Yeah. Sorry. That's when the left. I thought I was being sorted. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Welcome to today's meeting of the Audit and Scrutiny Committee. I'd like to begin with the usual items of protocol because today is a hybrid meeting with some participants joining us online. So please remember to switch your microphone on when you begin speaking and switch it off again when you finish your contribution. This will ensure members online can hear what you have to say and that your contribution is picked up on the recording. A copy of the recording will be made available on the Council's YouTube channel at the end of the meeting. If you are joining online and you'd like to raise a question or make a comment, please use the raise your hand function. Myself and officers attending will monitor proceedings to ensure all requests to speak are seen. And of course, please refrain from using the chat function for debate amongst one another online. To introduce the officers attending the meeting today, we have quite a number of people joining the committee this afternoon. We have Louise Pringle, Director of Business Operations and Partnerships. Margaret McCrossan, Head of Accountancy, is joining us remotely. Barbara Clark, Chief Accountant. Catherine McCormack, HR Manager. Michelle Blair, Chief Auditor. Debbie Hill, Chief Procurement Officer. Aidan Holligan, Strategic Services Assistant. Linda Hutchison, Senior Democratic Services Officer and Clerk to the Committee. Victoria Hartness, Committee Services Officer. Grace Scanlon from External Audit, Ernst & Young. And Morag Brown, our Strategic Services Lead Officer. And thank you for joining us. Which moves us on to the agenda proper for this afternoon. I have apologies from Councillor Annette Ireland. Are there any others, Clerk?
No, there are no further apologies, Chair.
Okay, that's super, thank you. Item 2, declarations of interest. The usual reminder that councillors are required to declare any financial or non-financial interests on any of the items in today's agenda in line with the Code of Conduct. Are there any declarations to be made? That's no declarations. Item 3, Chairman's report. Just one thing to update you on, which is to say, subsequent to the last meeting of the committee, I had a meeting with the Democratic Services Manager and Senior Democratic Services Officer, Linda Hutchison, and Barry Tudhope, and we had a discussion regarding the 24-25 work plan for this committee, and the product of that is incorporated in today's agenda at item 8. I'd like to also take this opportunity to thank the accountancy team for preparing the 23-24 unaudited accounts, which we'll be moving on to discuss shortly. Are there any comments on my report? No? Okay, agreed. Which does bring us on to item 4 in today's agenda, which is a review of the unaudited financial statements for the 23-24 year. And presumably Margaret is going to take this, or are you doing it in her absence, Barbara? Yeah, Barbara, over to you.
Thank you, Chair. I'm delighted to be in a position to present the annual accounts to you today. However, firstly, I have to report a typo on page 26, spotted by our committee chair, so thanks for that. The top of the two right-hand columns both say 22-23, but the left-hand side one should say 23-24, so apologies for any confusion that's caused. The annual accounts are a weighty tome. So today I would like to concentrate on 4 areas, in particular the revenue reserve, the capital spend, the housing revenue account and the management commentary. So firstly, the revenue reserve. I can report that the Council's affairs have been managed within its operational budget and that departmental savings of 6.9 million were achieved, enabling transfers of 6.2 million to be made to earmarked reserves, which will be proposed to Council in September for approval on completion of the audit. This leaves 0.7 million to be added to the non-earmarked reserve, which, along with the carried forward balance from last year, equates to 2.3% of the net revenue budget. This is within the Council's reserve policy to hold a level of between 2 and 4%. The budget savings made were mainly of a one-off nature and related to increased income, including interest earned on temporary investment balances and the recovery of a VAT appeal from HMRC dating back to 2006. There were also some savings relating to utilities and the catering service within the Education Department, along with staff vacancies. A list of reserve balances can be found in Note 11 on page 78, and descriptions of the functions of these reserves can be found on page 20. Moving on to capital expenditure, a total of just over 46 million has been invested during the year, and a high level split of this is shown in the table in the management commentary, using the same categories as we use for our budget monitoring, and this is on page 23. Thirdly, the housing revenue account. This finished with a deficit balance of 97,000, mainly due to increased costs in materials and subcontractors. This took their overall year-end surplus to just over 1.7 million, details of which can be found on the housing revenue account section on pages 118 and 119. Finally, I would like to draw your attention to the management commentary at the beginning of the document. This outlines the key messages on the objectives and strategy of the Council, as well as the financial performance during 23-24, and also indicates issues and risks which may impact upon the finances of the Council in future. In addition, updates on our digital transformation programme and achievements against our Get to Zero targets are also provided. Chair, I'm happy to take any questions on the accounts.
That's great. Thank you, Barbara. I'd like to open it to the floor for any questions which members may have. Councillor Wallace has indicated.
Yeah, is there anything about any, well, not so much savings, but expenditure that we didn't have to make through the revenue account because of capital projects that have maybe through timing have been delayed for interest for these? Thanks.
We do pay loan charges on our capital expenditure, and our capital expenditure wasn't as high as we'd initially planned for various reasons, and therefore our loan charges would be reduced as a consequence, albeit the principal repayment for current year's expenditure doesn't happen until the following year, so it's more of a saving in the following year. But what we do is we smooth the loan charges so that we match the budget against actual spend. So when the projects catch up in future years, we have sufficient budget to catch up with that.
If I could just follow up on that, does that that saving as such, does that show up as a surplus at the end of the year that we can put forward? What I'm trying to establish here is that it's just money that we didn't happen to spend this year but still have to spend in future years. Is that correct?
Well, what we've done is we've accrued that expenditure in 23-24, which means it's hit the bottom line in 23-24, albeit we haven't incurred the capital expenditure. So what we'll do is we're smoothing the payments, paying them early, if you like, so that in future years when we incur the capital cost, it's not going to be as big a spike for us.
Okay, Councillor Wallace, anything further or quite happy? Okay, I'd like to ask a question in that case, Barbara. It's with regards page 78. It's actually a matter which just kind of arose last night. You may be aware of the breakfast cart at Neilson Primary, and it's providing other primary schools across the authority. It's my understanding that the COVID fund which was sustaining that it will come to an end this month, and therefore this will now be picked up by the devolved school management budgets. Now, I can see on this note here on page 78 that the closing balance in that reserve was over £3.7 million. So will that be satisfactory to ensure that this service continues in the future?
That's a detail that I don't have to hand, I'm afraid. I can make inquiries when I go back to the office and get back to you.
Yeah, that would be much appreciated. I thought it'd be a point that might have to come forward, but I think to get some reassurance on that would be very helpful. Are there any further questions on the accounts at all? Are we happy to accept the draft? Okay, receiving acknowledgement of that. So thank you very much, and thank you, Barbara. So that takes us on to item 5 on the agenda, which is the Code of Corporate Governance, and I would like to invite Morag Brown to speak to this item. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chair. This is an annual report that the committee will be familiar with. It's on the Code of Corporate Governance, and it's an important part of checking the Council's arrangements for ensuring we've got proper governance arrangements in place and there's an effective use of resources. The Code is completed in line with national guidelines called Delivering Good Governance in Local Government, and those guidelines are produced by SITVA and SOLACE, and they set out 7 broad principles in terms of good governance. There's been no change to the national guidance this year, so the guidance that we're working to is the same as last year. It's really a 2-part process. We look back at the code from last year in terms of looking at the actions that we had to complete, and then we've undertaken an assessment, and we then use that to develop a new code for the year going forward for 24-25. So in terms of the backward look, we also, for transparency, publish that on the Council website. So that's the backward look has been published on the Council website from June. And details of the improvement actions that were listed in that code are listed in paragraph 9 of the report on page 152 of your paper. So that's in the backward look. The forward look in developing the new code, we undertake an assessment against the principles and the evidence that we have to demonstrate that. We work between January and March with colleagues right across the Council and the HSCP, colleagues in the Legal Department, Finance and Internal Audit, gathering all the evidence to demonstrate the extent of compliance. There's a 3-part scoring system from 1 not compliant to partially compliant through to 3 fully compliant. And we also identify and list any examples of new evidence. So in terms of that assessment process, our suggestion and proposal was that we were compliant across the majority of the code, with the exception of 3 small areas. This was based on the fact that the Council schemes of administration and delegated functions weren't updated last year because of staffing issues and obviously the election at the moment. So we felt that we couldn't score that to be fully compliant when that improvement action is still to take place. And the second, there is an action we're in the middle of reviewing our community planning frameworks, and therefore we felt that we should be partially compliant in that part of the code until those improvement actions are complete. And we also were a council, as you know, that we're always looking to continuously improve. So we also identify some actions that we think will further enhance our compliance, but it doesn't necessarily mean we're not compliant in those areas. And those new actions are listed on page 144 of the report. So just a few additional things, just points to note. As I said, for transparency, we put the how we performed against last year's code on the Council website, and subject to the agreement of the new code for 24-25, we will place that further to the committee's approval on the Council website, so that members of the public can see the code and the improvement actions that the Council is working towards in 24-25. So I guess in terms of recommendations, the committee is asked to note the progress against our actions and approve a new code for 24-25. Thanks very much.
That's great. Thank you very much, Morag. Are there any questions from fellow elected members? Councillor Wallace.
Thank you, Chair. We compare ourselves, or at least we use the SITVA SOLACE framework as a kind of guiding paper, if you like. Do we ever look at other councils and how they're operating in terms of deciphering what is best practice? Thanks.
Thanks, Councillor Wallace. Last year we did a more detailed look at how other councils actually implement their codes of corporate governance, and we made some changes in terms of streamlining down the code. You know, this is quite a weighty document, but we've streamlined it down. So we made changes, like rather than including every piece of evidence, we include it in a list in the matrix, but we only do summaries in the actual code. And the assessment found that the way in which we went about assessing the code, we felt we met good practice, but we did that assessment in detail last year.
Okay, it's just to understand how we decide what best practice is. Is it merely that we establish that we feel that we're going with the SIPFA guidelines, or do we, as I say, compare ourselves with other councils? Is there a document which says this is evidence of good practice? How do you compare against it? Yeah. Just one last question. Just with reference to having to delay the council standing orders, etc. Have you any concerns there at all that we should be worried about? Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Ross. So that's not something I don't have any concerns personally, but maybe Louise may respond to that. Thanks, Louise.
No particular concerns. We need to get through the general election now, and once we've done the general election work and hopefully given our staff some time for a holiday after that, because of all the work they're doing, we'll get onto that. That's a core part of our work programme in terms of democratic services for the rest of the year, so I don't have concerns about meeting the timeline that's in the document. Something we're busying ourselves with because we had nothing else to do. So yes, no concerns about that timeline.
Didn't know it was a general election on, they say sarcastically. Yeah. No, thank you very much for that. I'd like to throw a question at the mix myself, Morag. It's with regards F5.2, which is in page 143. So accelerate the development of an interface between the House and Servitor system and the Council's Integra financial system. I appreciate obviously that's been delayed somewhat due to a pressure of work in housing. Presumably the creation of that link between those two software suites will, however, alleviate work pressure. So I suppose the thrust of the question I'm getting to is the Council has the Investment for the Future reserve. Has any consideration been given to using some of that funding to get that kind of temporary boost in manpower required to get this link in place so that we can reap the benefits of the efficiencies made in the years to come? Thank you.
No, not particularly in terms of the Investing for the Future fund. The issue with the Servitor Integra interface is more one of capacity. Our housing service is implementing its own NEC housing system and is going through multiple phases of that. That is a big project for them. So our current challenge is to try and identify whether the Servitor Integra interface will actually deliver the benefits we hope it will in terms of financial controls and compliance and automation of some processes. But we need to balance that with there are core people in the housing service that must test that and must be involved in that project. So we're just trying to work out just now with the new head of service that's just come in what the best timing of that will be, and I've arranged a meeting with them in the next couple of weeks to discuss that profile and see how that will look. So it's not really a question of putting more money in it just now. There are key people that have the skills to do this work, but and I'd be reluctant to bring in others at this point. I think it's actually quite that interface is not it's not a common one in terms of what we're hearing from our suppliers in terms of these systems. So again, we want to make sure that we've got people who really understand that work. So yes.
But I appreciate that response, and I'm sure you can understand where I'm coming from, that the purpose of the fund is have a one-time benefit of spending that money. The aim is to do so in a way which delivers a recurring benefit. So I think you can see where I'm coming from. If there's any kind of software links or upgrades or improvements to systems that will result in ongoing efficiencies. That's something that obviously we would like to see.
We do also have the modernisation fund, Councillor Morrison, so that would really be our first port of call for things like that rather than the Investing for the Future fund. However, we do think that there will be some IT infrastructure calls on the Investing for the Future fund as well, based on a review we're doing just now. So we'll bear that in mind in terms of the various avenues we have.
Yeah, that sounds sensible. Thank you, Louise. Can I just check if there are any further questions on this item? I'd be happy to accept the recommendations. Okay, agreed. Thank you. So, and thank you for your input, Morag. It's appreciated. So, item 6 on the agenda is a review of the consultants' expenditure log, and I would like to invite the clerk of the committee to speak to this. Thanks.
Yes, thank you, Chair. This report, which you're familiar with, relates to the committee's interest in consultancy costs over a number of years. At the end of 2018, the Council agreed to establish a log regarding the appointment of consultants and reduce the threshold for allowing directors to appoint them from £50,000 to £10,000. During 2019, this committee agreed to review the log at the end of each financial year, and a copy of the most recent log is appended to the report for your consideration. So I'm simply recommending that you consider the feedback provided and discuss if there's any further action you would want taken regarding that, and otherwise I would ask you to note the report and that a further report will be submitted at the end of 24-25.
That's great. Thank you, Linda. I'd like to open with questions, one for myself. The item on page 179, so that's the table of the consultants' expenditure log. It's about the 10th item down. Employers, agents / quantity surveying services for council new build. Now, the contract award sum was £305,000, and I suppose the nature of my question is, new build housing, it's something which the council does on an ongoing basis and will continue to. So what's the kind of rationale behind outsourcing that to an external consultant rather than employing the requisite people to do that job in-house? Is there someone, Debbie?
Thank you, Chair. What I can tell you about this line is that there was a recruitment activity that was unsuccessful. It was a challenging marketplace and it continues to be so. Procurement's position around this would be that whenever we engage with services and they are looking to do anything external, we do ask, have they considered internal first? Can it be done internal? And only if it can't, do we then proceed to support them with an external activity.
Okay, I think that's a pretty clear answer, and presumably unless something changes with regards to the banding of those vacancies and the remuneration attached to them, then that's a problem which isn't really going to go away in the future. So, I mean, is there anything which the council should be doing or we should be doing as a committee to try and lobby for that change so that we can be competitive when going through recruitment?
Say, Councillor Morrison, that's part of our approach to workforce planning, and in terms of how we look at various services across the council that are experiencing challenges with recruitment. We also have work going on with Glasgow City Region to look at certain job roles which we struggle with, so we'll continue to do things like that. Our external auditors are doing a best value piece of work just now around workforce planning, so you'll be seeing that at committee in September, so there'll be further comment then.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that sounds sensible. If it's a case of the remuneration package has to be stretched a little further to get our own people in-house, would that deliver better value for money for the taxpayer rather than, outsourcing it where there's an extra profit margin added to the fact it's been outsourced to someone external, and we're not really building up that kind of continuity where somebody really gets to know the organisation and the council's strategy, and that informs what they do. If someone is external, then that's something they've got to acquire for themselves rather than having accumulated over years. Are there any other questions? I have Councillor Edwin and then Councillor Wallace.
I read a report that the British government have announced that they want to see consultancy fees reduced by 30%, and concerns of the consultancy firms of the effect that's going to have on them. But bearing that in mind, is this council going to be cutting the projected fees they're going to be paying to consultants over the next financial year? Or further beyond that, bearing in mind the swinging cuts that there have been imposed upon the HSCP in this area?
Thank you. What we do when we are going external is that we look at appropriate frameworks that exist, so compliant bodies that we can use and call off from. These rates that they have approved on their frameworks are market conditions, so they're effectively what are submitted as being relevant at the market at that time. We do consider that and conduct options appraisals to make sure that is best value, but that really is a at the time assessment, and we would continue to do that.
Loretta, supplementary?
Yes, well, I'm not clear what you mean by best value and appraisals. Could you expand on how that's done? Because obviously these costs seem to be running out of control, and unless there's some the criteria of the appointments are can be reconsidered, you're going to have a huge budget cost for doing this.
Sure. So to explain, when we engage a framework that has consultants on it, we invite them to respond with a competitive quote. So they may have submitted a rate to that framework, and what we would do is open that competition again with them and invite them to submit a further, more competitive rate. So we are seeking best value from them by testing them again at the time of needing their requirement.
Okay, is that satisfactory?
It explains the situation, but it doesn't alleviate my concerns that these costs are escalating to a level of quite of concern to me.
Okay, the committee notes your comment. Councillor Wallace, next.
Thank you. I did just in reference just to that conversation that's been had there. Do we have the situation in which quite clearly consultants will be offering a higher salary rate to individuals who the council could normally previously have employed themselves? And then, it's a bit of a chicken and the egg kind of thing where if these consultants have these people, we can't do it, therefore we have to go to the consultants and pay through the nose for that expertise. I may be stating the obvious here, but I don't know what controls there can be, what way we can control it, because am I right in thinking that we have certain pay grades aligned to certain job criteria, and there's absolutely nothing we can do about it? Could you confirm that first? I've got a couple of other questions, but yeah.
Councillor Wallace, I can talk about the council's job evaluation scheme. So that's correct. Each job is evaluated. So we're talking about local government here. Each job is evaluated, and points are basically assigned to that job based on the skills of that job and all the factors around it, and then that maps across to the pay grade.
And just on that, is that a nationally recognised job evaluation scheme that's national as opposed to East Renfrewshire?
That's right. It's the Scottish Joint National Council's job evaluation scheme, which is used across the majority of local governments in Scotland.
Well, just curious on that as to whether or not there would be the possibility that this is maybe something we can take through the likes of COSLA, for example, to find out whether or not we actually have to change that job evaluation rather than councils having to pay through the nose. I mean, it might well be ultimately that on balance it's the most cost-effective way of doing it at this stage when you look at jobs overall. But it may well be that there are certain. I mean, I know HR is a problem for you, so it may well be that there are certain grades that maybe nationally we have to look at the job evaluation in terms of availability of personnel. So that's just, if I can just finish on that. Well, I haven't finished, but that's on that subject I have.
I'll just come back on that point to say that we do obviously liaise quite closely with the COSLA regarding any sorts of roles where we're having difficulty fulfilling them. So we can obviously feed back if there's anything from today's committee.
When I'm looking back, I'm thinking of a number of years ago, we used to look at the number of consultants we were using, and I'm looking at this, I'm thinking we're actually using less than we had, but it may well be that the values changed, because there are certainly one or two things in there. But when we look at the new build and the consultation that we've been using for that, could I ask one question? With reference to, well, it'll be the new leisure centre, I'm thinking of, Townsend and Turner, for example, and other expenses, consultation expenses against new builds such as that. Firstly, does that go against the, I see Barbara Zoe, I'm wondering whether or not this goes against the capital budget or not, do we know?
Margaret is still online, Councillor Wallace, so I don't know if perhaps Margaret would be in a position to respond to that.
Yes, as you'll hear, I'm losing my voice, so I'll keep my answer very short. Yes, it is capital.
Further questions, Councillor?
Yes, please. It's now on the sustrans when I'm looking at, I mean, there's somewhere in the region of about 500,000 on consultation that's been allocated to presumably active travel, etc. One of the concerns, I understand, we've really had this conversation before, in that it's an area in which I should imagine there's a huge number of people that are tapping in on this, consultants who are tapping in on this, thinking this looks like a growing market, let's get involved here. I do see that we are using the hub, the West Scotland hub, which I presume they're using people who are well recognised. Is there a concern that the level of expertise is maybe not necessarily what it should be, i.e. the number of, I'd like to use a better term, but cowboys that will be out there. How do we establish who are the best people to use for this, and what's the availability of people, of competition in consultation for this type of work?
Thank you, Councillor. There are a number of bodies which we can use. So we look as part of the initial procurement activity and engagement across the market. So we have the likes of Scottish Government, Scotland Excel, Hub West that you've mentioned, Crown Commercial Services and others. What we'll do first of all is look to each of those to say, is there a requirement that meets what we are looking to do as a council? Once we establish that, we conduct an options appraisal as part of a contract strategy, which says, why do we want to use that particular route? What benefits do we see that will bring for us, and what are the supply chain that sits under that? So, for example, Hub West have an established supply chain, so I don't have the details to hand today, but it would be part of that review which said that was the most appropriate supply chain that we considered able to respond to that particular requirement at that time.
Would you say thank you for a very full response? Thank you. It certainly gives us confidence. Thank you.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. Councillor Buchanan.
Yeah, I think it's just.
Sorry, Chair, can't hear Councillor Buchanan.
You don't need to repeat the whole of it.
Apologies, Mary. I was just highlighting, it was interesting to hear a Conservative colleague complain about the excesses of the private sector and what they tend to charge. But what I would say is that from the COSLA point of view, certainly from an education point of view, Skills Development Scotland and indeed Education Scotland, as you'll be aware, we're looking at the processes of education and qualifications, etc., and apprenticeships, and how all of that factors in, particularly from a local government point of view, about making sure that we do have our own staff in terms of workforce planning that can carry out many of those jobs. So there is a lot of work going on just now about looking at the skill sets that are required, looking at working with employers, including councils, as to what we need in the future, and looking towards apprenticeships and working with lifelong learning and Skills Development Scotland to try and bring a more holistic approach to bringing all of those things together to look at the outcomes, which may well be we need more quantity surveyors, we need more bricklayers, we need more auditors, etc., and trying to bring all of that together to give us a workforce across the country which is fit for the future. So that is, again, a huge piece of work, but it is all factored into much of the ongoing strategies that are in place at the moment.
Okay, I'm not sure there's a question in that to be
Not a question, just highlighting some of the issues that are pertinent to workforce planning.
I start to get slightly worried about our PUDLA rules, so I don't want to have to go back and check what those are. So if I get as a kind of back on track, I wanted to ask a couple of questions. The first is regarding IR35, which officers were aware of. Do we have any instances, or are we mindful of instances where we have potentially former employees who leave the council's employment, who set up their own small limited companies, are then potentially contracted as external consultants? Because you'll know that the IR35 rules, HMRC take quite a dim view of that. Do we have things in place to ensure that that is not happening? Because obviously we wouldn't want to be losing people who are essentially employees who are setting up as limited companies to, save tax, for example, or to increase their remuneration?
To respond to that question, because actually Debbie and myself put together a policy which basically covers this. So any situation where a contractor, an agency worker comes into the council, every manager has to undertake the IR35 checklist on the gov.gov website. So we do have the process in place to make sure that we're covered for that.
That's fantastic. I mean, aside from the fact we don't want any kind of unknown liabilities coming at us in the future, it's also the ethical aspect as a public authority doing the right thing in terms of its tax obligations. The other question I have was actually communicated to me by Councillor Ireland, who obviously isn't here today, and it's with respect to the Eastwood Leisure Centre. That is actually a question I had too, so we'll ask it jointly. 2.5 million, I mean, that's obviously quite a significant portion of the budget for the leisure centre so far, and we don't have a leisure centre as of yet. So, I mean, I just wonder what exactly does that 2.5 million entail, and is it appropriate that it's recorded here when it's more of a capital cost rather than a revenue cost, if you see what I mean? Okay, Margaret? Sorry to strain your voice again.
That's okay. Part of it might be for specific technical advice on some changes we've made, but much of it is for the ongoing management of the project, so that it's not all for advice perhaps on one narrow technical aspect. It's for the overall, keeping it on track, and bear in mind that the project is going to be taking much longer than we expected because we chose to put it on ice effectively for 2 years. So we've had to revisit the design a number of times, and we have advised of different cost restrictions, and all of that, of course, is additional work for the consultants. So that hopefully gives a better flavour. It's not just for individuals' consultancies, it's for the overall management plus technical advice as well.
And if I could just ask on the follow-up to that, I mean, presumably with such a large project, it would be quite standard for a local authority to seek external support for a project of this nature. Would that be fair to say?
Yes, and there are fixed fee rates when you use Hub. So we know what the fee rates are going to be, and we take a view on each project, whether it's something that we feel we can procure and manage ourselves, or whether it's something that we should do externally using an outside body such as Hub. In cases like this, you've heard several times already this afternoon that we just don't have enough staff to carry on with our day-to-day work as well as driving some of those very large projects. We just don't have the capacity. And therefore, for some projects, we have to go external.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you, Margaret. I just want to check, are there any further questions in the wash-up at all? We'll be quite happy to accept this item and move on. Yeah, okay, that's agreed in that case. So that brings us on to item 7 on the agenda, which is the internal audit report on payroll. So we did have a bit of a going over this at the last committee. I think, is it Louise, are you taking that one first? Or Kath? Kath, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. So there are a number of points raised at the Audit and Scrutiny Committee in May relating to overpayments, and I would like to clarify and respond to some of the points raised. There will be a level of detail which I'll be unable to go into. However, I want to assure the committee that this issue has been discussed in detail with the corporate management team. New processes have been put in place, and we're currently working through a small number of cases. The payroll team processes around 11,000 transactions each month across 4 payrolls. This is around 135,000 transactions per year to the value of over £150 million. Two issues were raised at the committee through an audit report, one related to a system-based issue and the other related to general overpayments. The first issue the committee discussed was an issue affecting some employees on multi-week patterns. This means patterns that are not standard 35 hours a week, but patterns that can be, for example, 8 weeks. This issue was discovered during an internal audit. This is not an unimportant issue, but it's not at a substantial level. I can confirm that the issue affected approximately 100 employees as a one-off when they either started or left the council's employment. This resulted in the value of an overpayment of around £4,000 across these employees and a £2,000 underpayment. This was not a reoccurring issue for these individual employees. The council worked with a payroll supplier to implement a permanent fix. The supplier is monitored using the council's corporate contract and supplier management model, and we continue to work closely with them. Secondly, there were a number of queries raised about overpayments made to employees and the process of reclaim. The rate of overpayments versus the number of transactions processed per year is 0.07%. This is based on around 135,000 annual transactions versus 93 live overpayments that we're dealing with. The industry rate of overpayments is around 3% according to the Chartered Institute of Payroll. Overpayments can occur for a number of reasons, including late or lack of notification of somebody leaving the council, sickness, absence and contractual changes. Other issues can include staff not returning from maternity leave on the expected date, an error being made when inputting an entitlement to the system, a duplication of a timesheet or overtime sheet being submitted and approved, and a system error. Payroll have always worked to recover overpayments. However, it was recognised that to reduce the level of overpayments further, we would need to raise awareness across the council. For this reason, an overpayment policy has been introduced to tackle this issue. There was engagement with trade unions and departments in setting this up. At present, we have £62,000 worth of overpayments which are actively being recovered through the salary deduction process. Regular overpayment reports are now also shared with heads of service, which allows services to address the root cause of issues and determine if there's human error, or to understand if there are any underlying process or system issues that may be causing the overpayment. Another point raised at the committee related to the inclusion of statutory sick pay in the audit report and the view that the calculation of this was not in line with HMRC guidance. To confirm, the points raised by audit were observations and were not based on any errors being found with the calculation of sick pay. Audit have since agreed that the system does calculate sick pay correctly. To close off, I would like to assure the committee that the necessary corrective action has been taken for both of these issues. We're working closely with internal audit, and management have taken these issues incredibly seriously. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you, Kath, and thank you for the response following the discussion we had at the previous meeting. I'd like to open up to questions. We have an opportunity whilst Kath and Louise are here if anyone has any questions that they would like to ask on this item. Councillor Edlin.
That was quite a, if I use the word, comforting report to receive, because despite what we heard last time, we have to put it in context, and that does. I think you said it was the errors were 0.07% overpayment versus 3% industry wide. So it really is quite a good outcome. So thank you.
Okay, that's great. Thanks, Councillor Edlin. I've a couple of questions I'd like to follow up on myself, which is it's really reassuring to know that the error so far as those multi-week work patterns are concerned. We're talking about a net difference here of £2,000, which is immaterial by anyone's kind of auditing standards in terms of the council's accounts. But coming back to the internal audit report, the total overpayments which had been identified were 57.3 thousand. So I'm quite satisfied that the multi-week issue, which has been sorted by the payroll providers, is basically could be considered a closed issue. But with regards to the notification of leavers, for example, which has implications beyond just the payroll, but issues around ICT, security, building assets, can I ask what procedures are in place for the reporting of leavers, and in the course of all this situation, has there been any improvements to that process identified?
Yes, thank you. So again, we've worked very closely with internal audit and taken on quite a lot of their advice regarding this. So we do have an electronic leavers form which managers are asked to complete when somebody's due to leave the organisation. So HR received that, and what we also do now is we actually send a report to IT to inform them of any leavers, and managers are reminded to also notify IT and any other system, department that perhaps Integra, for example, to make sure that any leavers are taken off all necessary systems.
I suppose the next question would be, we're happy that the systems are there. Has there been any kind of identified weaknesses in terms of adherence to those systems? And I suppose what would then happen next? Has there been particular departments or areas where this has been noted as being an issue, and perhaps there's a training need arising?
So with the new reports that are now going to the heads of service, where there are any issues in terms of late notifications or basically not informing HR or payroll of leavers, we're now following up with those departments to educate them and talk through the processes to see is there anything that we can do to support them. So for example, we send out a 4-weekly email to managers. Do we have the right distribution list, for example? So we're just continually looking at this, and there's also another project, I guess, that Louise could mention.
I guess we're conscious, just as we look at things generally in the council, we're conscious that leavers is certainly a topic that comes up time and time again in internal audit reports, and when we look at things, and that's from a range of different places, as you said, IT, HR, various places. So it's something we're keen to look at. So we have kicked off a bit of scoping work. I need to just build that into a wider programme, but a bit of scoping work to map out leavers processes in the council. We've started with the HR ones, but we would like to take that wider. And then start to see if there's ways to automate and link up some of those processes so it becomes a bit slicker. It's certainly an ambition we would have through our digital transformation programme, but as I say, we haven't got a firm piece of work. We're scoping just now. It's not firmly in the programme, but it is something we're trying to find a space for.
That's great, thank you, Louise. An idea which has actually just come into my head as we've been sitting here having a discussion. I appreciate not all of our staff use IT systems and would be checking into email perhaps as regularly as yourself, who's probably checking it multiple times in a day. Is there any kind of reporting from IT which can be made available in terms of, are there any IT accounts which haven't been logged into for a long period of time? Because that may be a way of automatically identifying who's potentially left the council's employment versus who's in long-term sick.
We do that routinely, Councillor Morrison. That would be part of our PSN, our Public Services Network audits for IT. So it's very important that we make sure that we disable IT accounts that haven't been used for some time. So there's a few procedures round about that as well.
But that also feeds into reviewing the payroll to make sure those people have come off the payroll too. It does.
I don't think all these processes are as joined up as they could be just now, which would be part of the work that we'd be trying to do if we can find space in the digital transformation programme. So that is what we're starting to scope out just now as a team.
Okay, that's reassuring, thank you. Are there any further questions before we move on? Councillor Wallace?
Just an observation in terms of the language that we're using. I appreciate, we sort of say that £2,000 is incidental when we're talking about our 220 odd million turnover, but I'm sure the person that gets their council tax through and's got £2,000 to pay doesn't see it as being incidental. So just okay, thanks. Bye.
I think that's a fair point. It's essentially someone paying council tax twice over. Yeah, it's a valid point. Councillor Edlin, did you indicate?
Just the point that Louise made there. Your grant was not as joined up as they should be, I think is what I wrote down that you said. Can you clarify that and how you would like to see it develop?
I think my wording was could be.
Oh, sorry, my mistake.
But I would also go to, we're in a scoping piece which will tell me that. I have a suspicion based on the audit actions that come out regularly from various areas that these things are not as joined up as I suspect they could be. But that we need to go and scope that out and look for all the places and then see if we can come up with some more digital ways of linking these things up and automating, so that it shouldn't be on individual teams to have to do lots of different processes around leavers. Ideally, it would operate a bit like Tell Us Once nationally, that actually something goes in somewhere and that feeds out to all the places it needs to be. But that's quite a big piece of work, so we're on that just now, just trying to identify where that scope might be.
Okay, Grant. Last opportunity, any questions? I'll be happy to accept and move on. Yes. Well, thank you very much for coming along and for giving us such a detailed update on our discussion. Thank you. So that brings us to the last item on today's agenda, which is the Audit and Scrutiny Committee work plan for the current year and the year ahead. As I refer to in my report, I'd like to invite Linda to speak to this. Thanks.
I don't think there's much to add to what's in the report. I mean, as you're aware, these work plans are considered live documents, and they help the committee schedule and prioritise its work over the course of a year. So the report is asking you to note and consider performance against the work plan for 23-24 and approve the draft work plan for 24-25 to the extent it has been developed thus far. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you, Linda. Of course, some of the external audit reports we consider, it's contingent on them being published by Audit Scotland in due course. Does anyone have any questions at all on this item? Quite happy to accept the work plans as they stand. Taking that as a yes? Yeah? Okay. Well, with that, that brings today's meeting to a close. Oh, maybe not. Councillor Wallace.
Thank you, Chair. If I could just make an observation. I mean, we're here as an audit committee to sort of better understand the decision-making process and the consequent action that officers take, and where we feel that there may be something amiss is to perhaps challenge some of these decisions. And I just find it a bit frustrating and off-putting when we get a member of our committee actually putting the party name next to the person that is asking the question. I, as along with every other member here, are asking questions on behalf of residents. It is not a political hat. We are here non-political hats, if you like, just asking questions on behalf of the residents. And just lastly, is that I think it would be preferable to get answers coming from officers, and if we don't have the officer available at the time, to perhaps ask for further clarification at a meeting further, rather than having members of the committee answering their own questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Wallace. I suppose I would add to that when an issue is raised, the clerk and myself, we do work to bring the relevant officers in to the committee to have a full discussion, as Kath's attendance today has demonstrated, as Murad's attendance today has demonstrated, and irrespective of what other members of the committee may say in their own contributions, we will always ensure that the officers are here to provide the answers which members of the committee speak. And with regards politics, I try to approach this as in a politically neutral way as possible, as chair of the committee. And I'm sure for the residents who are watching this, they're all probably a bit sick and tired of party politics, given the UK general election. With that, today's business is now closed. Thank you for your attendance.